Hello, and thank you for joining my paper, Holding the Street and Demanding Attention, Overseas Reactions to Australian Larrikin Gangs. On 21st of May 1898, the South Australian Register newspaper in Adelaide published a leader titled Larrikins, Scuttlers and Hoodlums. It opened, quote, "In many highly civilised cities, the juvenile offender has begun to think that he is the master of the situation. Gangs of scuttlers roam the streets of some of the largest British towns, occasionally attacking foot passengers and policemen with bowie knives, and even with pistols. In America, the hoodlums of almost every large centre place themselves constantly in evidence. In some parts of the continent, there are organised bodies of young leaguers, and in Australia, we have the irrepressible larrikin. One may not be able to prove that in numerical proportions, the ranks of the juvenile criminals and young roughs are actually increasing, but undoubtedly the boldness and confidence with which the youthful transgressor swaggers about our cities are visibly augmenting. A larrikin push occasionally take possession of a whole street, and for a time successfully defy the officers of the law." End quote. The article then judged that London possessed the true genus larrikin, after referencing an exposé first printed in the London St. James Gazette in April that same year, titled "The London Larrikin by One Who Knows Him," which profiled three gangs in Clerkenwell and Islington, their weapons, internal structures, members' upbringing and daily lives, and effective forms of punishment. This piece of investigative journalism stated that, quote, "Certain districts are infested by gangs of young ruffians who make a practice of patrolling the streets nightly, insulting, assaulting, and robbing, and generally making things exceedingly unpleasant for all but the most vigorous and determined citizens." End quote. The exposé was reprinted in both Australia and New Zealand. Here are examples of the transoceanic news and discussions about street gangs that occurred from the second half of the 19th century onwards. During this period, young people were active in struggles for the control of urban spaces as cities expanded and transformed. Youth gangs laid claim to neighbourhoods, and their distinctive use of public space saw them draw lines across their cities and act according to alternative maps with marked topographies. Young people took the streets for themselves, often with little regard for other members of the community. They made their presence known with eye-catching attire, physical intimidation, and verbal and musical accompaniment. Concern over the damaging effects of urban life and a degeneracy crisis brought youth gangs and street cultures into focus in European societies worldwide. And as anxiety grew, they made a newsworthy topic for rising numbers of newspapers with increasing circulations and print runs. Coverage and fascination grew across cities and continents. By focusing on overseas reactions to Australian street gangs, this paper explores how these young people figured globally and how gangs characterised their cities and vice versa. This paper considers the extended discussion stimulated by the topic of larrikins and deploys a trans-urban approach to highlight the influence of connections and interactions across borders and how cities and towns were defined, measured, and compared with reference to their defiant youthful residents. Australian larrikins were male and female youths, generally unskilled and semi-skilled labourers aged 12 to 20, whose antics and acts, which included idling on pavements, harassing pedestrians, vandalism, drinking and dancing, and wearing snazzy trousers, outraged Australian society into the early 20th century, generating intense, sustained, and often sensational social commentary. The first larrikins occupied the streets and vacant lots of Melbourne and were acknowledged by the local press in 1870. Quickly, the term was adopted across Australia, and news was taken far and wide by the global movement of people and information. A key component to the international coverage of street gangs was the spawning of various descriptors in different cities. The examples on screen have received scholarly attention to greater and lesser extents. When it comes to Britain, there are clusters of single city studies. For Australia, Melbourne and Sydney dominate. My research considers how these young people and their cities were discussed alongside one another. In November 1908, an article in the British periodical Pearson's Weekly mused on the appearance of the word hooligan in Serbia, and proceeded to give a list with brief etymologies of similar names used in other lands. This article was paraphrased in the McGrath Pioneer in Alberta, Canada, the following March. It read, quote, "In Australia, what England dubs a hooligan, they call a larrikin. On the other side of the Pacific, in San Francisco, he becomes a hoodlum. New Orleans designates him a copperhead. Paris styles him an apache. In Georgetown, he is known as a Santopee. The Neapolitan hooligan is a Lazaro. In Calcutta, he is Budmash. In Birmingham, he is a Peaky Blinder. New York is content to know him simply as a tough or Bowery boy. Scorpion is the name applied by the British resident in Gibraltar." End quote. Whilst not all of these were used exclusively to refer to the juvenile street gangs, they do point to the global nature of this topic and how gangs were associated with different cities. It was through travelling language that this subject was partially sustained. New words, some with uncertain, even mysterious or contentious origins, provoked curiosity, and none more so than larrikin. Theories abounded at the time and since, with one well-known tale featuring a stuttering Melburnian policeman with an Irish accent. Others attribute the word to a few different English dialects, or to music hall culture, which was very popular with working-class youths in cities. In fact, in 1890, Scottish writer and theatre critic William Archer described gaiety burlesque as, quote, "the art to which the larrikin of Melbourne, the hoodlum of Frisco, and the pelican of Pall Mall all thrill in ecstatic unison," end quote. To him, it was not only the national art form, but imperial and international in appeal. In the late 19th century, larrikins and hoodlums were go-to reference points when describing disorderly young people, with the former often characterized as the world's worst juveniles. Parallels were drawn between the two as products of so-called new nations. Larrikins also suffered from associations with convict legacies from the Old World, especially when it came to commentary on their most outrageous behavior. California and Australia were well connected economically and culturally at this time, especially as mid-century gold rushes saw the movement of people between the two locations. A newspaper article published in America in 1889 posited that hoodlums were the offspring of riotous and criminal penal colony immigrants from the 1840s, known as the Sydney Coves or Sydney Ducks. Interestingly, in his Tales of Underworld San Francisco, writer Herbert Asprey, best known for his 1927 book Gangs of New York, describes the Sydney Ducks as ruffianly larrikins. These immigrants congregated on Telegraph Hill, where hoodlums would later be active, and which was previously called Sydney Town. Both hoodlums and larrikins were notorious for their violence towards Chinese citizens. In late 1878, a period of intensified anti-Chinese feeling would produce a fateful riot involving Sydney larrikins. On 4th of December at Hyde Park in Sydney, more than 2,000 youths aged 14 to 20 gathered. A breakaway group headed to the city's principal Chinese residences and cabinet workshops on George Street. In the 1870s, Chinese carpenters had been making their mark as serious competitors in the furniture trade in New South Wales through their ability to undersell their rivals. The mob ominously carried blazing torches. Extensive fire damage was prevented, but there were assaults and houses, businesses, and residents were stoned. Commenting a month later, the Pall Mall Gazette in London drew parallels between the larrikins involved and American hoodlums, both of whom represented a most dangerous, unmanageable class. In mid-July the year before, somewhat foreshadowing events in Sydney, 2 days of anti-Chinese riots in San Francisco resulted in extensive destruction of property and 4 deaths. A couple of weeks later, the Evening News in Sydney featured a piece praising the development of Chinese cabinet makers' craft. It had contained prophetic warning that if the same progress continued, a similar riot would likely occur, as it did in Sydney. In addition to links to gold rushes and convict heritage, colonial connections were used to explain larrikinism. Larrikins were described as a colonial growth, a species developed by the climate, outdoor living, a meat-rich diet, immigration, and unsettled families. Alongside the Australian colonies was the colony of New Zealand, where the word larrikin also entered the language. As news coverage spread, so did the notion that a moral disease was advancing, and the larrikins of Victoria represented an unwelcome future for New Zealand. Larrikin discourse was used by journalists and residents to define and position local urban development and articulate their anxieties. Urban expansion was double-edged. A letter to the editor of the Wanganui Herald in February 1874 complained of young men on street corners passing unpleasant remarks to married women on Sundays. The writer viewed this behaviour, somewhat ironically, as an indicator of the advance of civilization in the town. A year later, a leader in the Wanganui Chronicle claimed that local larrikins were, quote, evidence of the increasing prosperity and growing importance of our town, end quote. Synthesized summary bulletins of news from other towns, supplementing Australian and local stories, added to the sense that the topic of larrikins was spreading. Reports of growing larrikinism or sporadic outbreaks in Christchurch and Auckland, particularly in the 1880s and 1890s, drew comparisons with Melbourne and Sydney and amplified fears. Nonetheless, residents of some towns could find consolation in the fact larrikinism was presenting itself in a milder form there than elsewhere. Dialogue and comparisons were therefore both inter- and intra-colonial. Larrikins would garner new attention in the 1880s and 1890s thanks to the Pushes, the name given to larrikin gangs. Two events in Sydney would have a profound impact on larrikins' international reputation. In September 1886, members of the Waterloo Push gang raped a young woman on scrubland in eastern Sydney. This horrifying attack, known as the Mount Rennie outrage or Moore Park outrage, led to unprecedented public uproar and intense discussion and debate across Australia. 4 of the perpetrators were hanged. In a letter sent to the Sheffield Daily Telegraph, a Sheffield Smith living in Sydney commented on how the shocking nature of the case represented how larrikinism had assumed such frightful proportions, and only the gallows could suppress it. Others declared that such crimes were far too common in the colonies. A visiting correspondent for the Melbourne Northern Whig, through reference to Lord Byron's poem Don Juan, attributed the blatant immorality shown not to convict heritage, nor to immigration and the diverse population, but instead to the hot climate. News of the case also brought reflection on circumstances in the UK. An impassioned letter to the editor of the Daily Western Times in December 1886, signed A Mother, praised the severe and prompt action taken in Sydney and criticised the, quote, trivial punishment given for such abominable crimes in the UK, end quote. The Pall Mall Gazette drew comparisons between the Mount Rennie outrage and the gang rape of a 15-year-old female in Folkestone, southeast England. Astonishment was expressed at the fact only 4 of the 18 men at the scene were sent to the assize, whereas in Sydney several had received tough punishments. Sydney's larrikin gangs gained further notoriety after the brutal murder of a 37-year-old sailor by members of the Millers Point Push in June 1893. The deceased had several run-ins with the gang in the weeks before his death, until one Sunday morning, not far from his residence, he was involved in an altercation and, after more youths arrived, he tripped as he tried to escape. On the ground, he was kicked repeatedly and died soon after being brought back home by his brother. The sailor hailed from Montrose in eastern Scotland, and the murder was reported in local Scottish newspapers 6 weeks later, and was regarded as an illustration of the despicable and inborn criminal passion of the irrepressible Australian larrikin. As well as the violent and fatal nature of the attack, other circumstances of the murder added to larrikin's exaggerated infamy. That the deceased had been a marked man and vengeance was ultimately enacted increased the perceived power and terror of larrikin gangs, for whom the police were no match and from whom civilians cowered. Further news, images and commentary of and from Sydney were presented to readers in the UK in the 1890s and contributed to understandings of who larrikins were and what they did. Larrikin pushes, their brutality, and the accompanying terror and panic formed a considerable part of this coverage at this time. Concurrently, discussions of gangs in London increased. Geoffrey Pearson, in his seminal 1893 analysis of London's 1898 hooligan panic, touches on the use of larrikin to describe juvenile delinquents in Britain before hooligan had established itself in the English language, and cites an 1898 article in the Spectator magazine entitled London Larrikins. Whilst there would be comparisons with Australian larrikins during the hooligan panic at the turn of the century, before then the word larrikin was incorporated into a long discourse and escalation of anxiety over juvenile ruffianism and street gangs in London. The Spectator had, in fact, first expressed concern at English larrikins in 1880. Historian Heather Shaw has actively sought to look beyond the delirium of 1898 and has traced youth gang conflicts in London back to the early 1880s. In her study, Shaw, like the journalist writing in the South Australian Register, whom I mentioned at the start of the paper, notes the difficulty in discerning between the actual growth of a broader street gang culture and the labelling of youths by a shared language developed by the police, prosecutors, witnesses, and the press. What is clear is that the word larrikin was a significant part of that common language. This was particularly so from the late 1880s onwards. As gang-related crimes in London gained more attention and appeared in the papers with increasing frequency, parallels were drawn with the pushes of Sydney. One notable case was the stabbing of a 22-year-old printer's machinist in May 1888 in North London. He would later die of his injuries. The incident, the result of a gang feud, was dubbed the Regent's Park murder and was a subject of sensational and exaggerated press coverage. Within a week of the murder, a widely reprinted report from London stated that the city's epidemic of crime was not abating. The London letter included a summary of how larrikin had become the sobriquet of choice in Australia to describe perpetrators of street brutalities. It was put forward that larrikin was the term that would best apply to the band of youths involved in the murder. Having pressed the then Home Secretary to act on England's larrikins at the start of the decade, the Spectator carried an article that addressed the Regent's Park murder with reference to Australian larrikins. Our Larrikins, as it was titled, was concerned with a problem that was believed to affect both the colonies and England, namely the thousands of boys and girls who socialised on the streets after finishing work, and the exploits of street gangs in particular. The situation in England was compared with America, Australia, and continental Europe, but parallels with Melbourne and Sydney were emphasised. In October 1888, the Pall Mall Gazette featured an article that lamented the incapability of the authorities to cope with disorder in London. The opening paragraph stated that the hoodlum and larrikin were the abiding problems of the age and represented an undisciplined generation. The two-page report included ground-level investigative journalism from Marylebone and a sample index of bandit gangs of London. The names were said to have been taken from police court records of the preceding year and largely reflected the place-based associations mentioned by Heather Shaw. This was the beginning of a decade of increased agitation over street gangs in London, a discourse in which the word larrikin would feature prominently and would be used by the press, letter-writing citizens, and politicians. Direct references to and comparisons with Australian larrikins would continue to be made, and none would be more striking than that by the Lord Mayor of London on 14th of January 1889. The Lord Mayor presided on cases at Mansion House, and on this occasion he heard of an unprovoked assault on a painter crossing the Thames on Blackfriars Bridge after midnight the Sunday just gone. The man was attacked by a group of youths, all 17 years old, who knocked him over and proceeded to kick him. As the Globe reported on its front page, quote, "One of the gang seems to have hit him with the now favourite weapon of the larrikin, not only in London but elsewhere, the buckle end of a belt," end quote. Historian Andrew Davis has described the big buckled belt as a customary weapon amongst Manchester's scuttler gangs. Wrapped around the wrist and with the weighty buckle hurled at an adversary, the belts could inflict serious but crucially not fatal injury. Belts were also linked to status, being used in major fights or reprisals, and buckles carried designs denoting gang membership and could be taken as the spoils of war. A larrikin then was clearly a gang member. Having made their attack on Blackfriars Bridge, the quote, "precious specimens of young England ran away," end quote. But two were apprehended by the victim in the vicinity of St. Paul's Cathedral. When sentencing the two youths, the Lord Mayor regretted to say that assaults like this were becoming more common, representing the introduction into London of what was called in Australia the larrikin element. Reports of these words came under the headline London Larrikins, a phrase that would be used increasingly in the 1890s in the discourse on juvenile gangs. This paper has presented the different ways in which the subject of street gangs, and larrikins in particular, excited reactions in the late 19th century, crossed borders, and was shaped by the transoceanic circulation of news, and spoke to both local and international concerns. Thank you for listening.